My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 32 years old, and the week I finally closed on my first home was the same week my sister made one phone call that erased 6 years of my life in under 4 minutes. She didn't use a weapon. She didn't show up at my door. She used a voice she had practiced her whole life. The soft, concerned one she saved for moments when she wanted to destroy something and look like she was trying to help. And it worked, at least for a while. I had worked at Hargrove and Lane, a mid-sized marketing firm, for 6 years. 6 years of early mornings, late submissions, missed weekends, and quiet sacrifices that nobody clapped for. I had built something real there. Not flashy, not loud, but solid. The kind of career that grows slowly because the roots go deep. The day I signed my mortgage papers, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the title company and cried. Not because I was sad. Because I had done something nobody in my family had done before me. I had bought something that was mine. No cosigner, no handout, no one's name on the deed but my own. I called my mother first. She said, "That's nice, honey. Have you told your sister yet?" I called my sister second because that's what you do when you've spent your whole life believing that family means something. Her name is Diane. She's 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, everything I had was something she had first imagined for herself and decided I had stolen. When I got the marketing job, she said I must have slept my way in. When I got promoted, she told our parents I had probably exaggerated my qualifications. When I got engaged to my boyfriend, Marcus, before that fell apart, which is its own story, she cried at the dinner table and told everyone she had introduced us, which she had not. I told myself those things were just Diane being Diane. I told myself that too many times, because the week I bought my house, Diane called my director of operations, told him I had been falsifying client reports, and suggested he check whether my role was even necessary anymore. She didn't stop there. She also sent an anonymous email to HR with 3 claims so specific and so carefully worded that they sounded almost credible to someone who didn't know the truth. By Thursday of that same week, I was called into a meeting I hadn't been prepared for. By Friday, I was carrying a cardboard box to my car. I didn't find out it was Diane until 8 months later. But the moment I did, I understood something clearly. She hadn't done it in anger. She had done it in calculation, and that scared me more than anything else. Before I tell you what happened when I found out, and what I did after that, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? I'm always curious how far these stories travel. Drop your city in the comments. I read everyone. The Monday after I was let go started the way all catastrophic Mondays do. Quietly, with coffee I hadn't touched, and a phone I kept checking as though someone was going to call and tell me it had been a mistake. No one called. I had worked at Hargrove and Lane since I was 26. I had started as a junior content coordinator and built my way up to senior account strategist. It wasn't a glamorous title, but it was mine, and I had earned every letter of it. My director, Robert Ashby, had been the one to let me go. Robert was not a cruel man. He was the kind of man who delivered bad news the same way he delivered good news, with a slight downward tilt of his head and eyes that said he wished he were somewhere else. He had told me the allegations were serious, that HR had been involved, that they couldn't ignore the complaint given its specificity. I asked what the complaint said. He handed me a printed summary. Falsified client engagement data across Q2 and Q3. Misrepresentation of campaign results to secure contract renewals. Possible invoice discrepancies. I read it twice, then a third time. The words blurred not because I was crying, but because my brain refused to connect them to anything true. I had never falsified anything. In 6 years, the one thing I had been consistently proud of was the precision of my work. Numbers were not approximate in my world. Numbers were how I protected my clients and my reputation at the same time. I told Robert this. He nodded the way people nod when they've already decided and want the conversation to end. They had also received an anonymous email, he said carefully, from someone claiming to have direct knowledge of the discrepancies. Anonymous. That word sat in the room between us like something that had just arrived without being invited. I cleaned out my desk in 20 minutes. My colleague Priya watched from across the office with wide eyes. She mouthed, "Are you okay?" And I shook my head just slightly because it was the most honest answer I had. In the elevator, I held the cardboard box against my chest and stared at the floor numbers counting down and thought about the mortgage payment I had already scheduled for the 15th. I had savings. Not a fortune, but a cushion. 6 months, maybe 7 if I was careful. I told myself I had time. I told myself I would figure it out. What I didn't tell myself was that somewhere behind all of this was someone who had meant for it to happen. Not yet. The first weeks were the kind of quiet that rings. I applied to every position I was qualified for. I rewrote my resume 4 times. I reached out to former clients who knew my work directly, not through Hargrove and Lane's name, but through the results I had personally delivered. Most were warm. A few mentioned vaguely that they had heard something, that there were questions, that they wanted to give it some time. That phrase, "give it some time," told me more than anyone intended. Someone had been talking, not just to my employer, to the industry. The anonymous email had not been the only move. I spent 2 months trying to find work at my previous level and kept running into soft walls. Conversations that started well and ended with delays. Promises to follow up that never materialized. One hiring manager, a woman I had met at a conference 3 years before and who had always been kind, pulled me aside after an informal coffee and said almost reluctantly, "Claire, I don't know what happened at your last company, but whatever someone is saying, it's reaching people. You might want to get ahead of it." I drove home that day with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles went pale. Get ahead of it. How do you get ahead of something when you don't know its shape? I had no name, no face, no origin point. I had a printed summary from HR and the word anonymous hanging in the air like smoke. I started over. I took a contract position at a small agency called Ridgeline Creative. The pay was less than half my previous salary. The work was basic. I was essentially doing in 3 hours what used to take me a full day, because the scope was so much smaller. But I showed up every day. I delivered everything on time. I was polite and professional and gave no one any reason to look twice. And I paid my mortgage. That house was never going to be a casualty of whatever was happening to me. If I had to eat plain pasta for 3 months to keep that deed in my name, that is exactly what I would do. My mother called once in that period to ask how things were going. I said fine. She said, "You know, Diane has been very worried about you." I said that was kind of Diane. I still didn't know. The truth arrived 8 months after I was fired, and it arrived the way most truths do. Not through a dramatic confrontation, but through something small and accidental that turned out to be the exact wrong moment for someone to be careless. My cousin Nadia called me on a Tuesday evening. We were not especially close, but we were the kind of cousins who checked in occasionally, who texted on birthdays, who remembered each other without being required to. Nadia had always been straightforward in the way some people in families are allowed to be because they exist slightly outside the drama. She called to catch up, she said. And for the first few minutes, it was genuinely that. Then she went quiet in the way people go quiet when they've been carrying something. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not panic before I finish." I sat down. Nadia told me that 2 months earlier, she had been at a dinner with Diane and 2 of Diane's friends. a casual birthday gathering that Nadia had been invited to because their aunt had suggested it. During that dinner, after enough wine had been poured, Diane had said something that had been sitting in Nadia's chest ever since. She had said, in reference to my job loss, she needed to be taken down a notch. She was getting too comfortable. One of Diane's friends had laughed nervously and asked what Diane meant. Diane had waved her hand and said, "I just made a call. That's all. I told them what I knew about her reports." Nadia had gone cold at the table. She had said nothing in the moment because she hadn't known how. But the more weeks passed, the more the silence felt like participation. I sat with the phone at my ear long after she finished. "Claire," Nadia said, "are you there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here." "I'm so sorry I waited." "You called," I said. "That's what matters." I stayed on the phone with her for another hour, but I remember almost nothing of what was said. I was somewhere else. I was standing outside myself watching the last 8 months rearrange into a story that finally had a beginning. She had made a call. She had told them what she knew about my reports. Except she had known nothing. She had invented it. Or she had distorted something small until it became unrecognizable. Either way, she had walked to a phone, dialed a number, and used a voice people trusted, and she had done it the same week I bought my house. I thought about the timing for a long time that night. Not coincidence. Not jealousy in an impulsive moment. She had waited for the highest point. She had waited until there was something real to take away. That told me something about her I had never let myself fully believe before. This was not the first time. This was the first time I had proof. I didn't call her. I know that might surprise some people. When you find out something like that, the instinct is to pick up the phone and tear through the silence you've been living in. I understood the instinct. I felt it in the palms of my hands. But I had spent 8 months learning to be patient in ways I never had been before. I had applied for positions and waited. I had watched opportunities narrow and found other doors. I had paid a mortgage on a contract salary and kept my mouth shut when people said vague things about my reputation. I was not going to let 8 months of discipline collapse into one angry phone call that she could spin into evidence of my instability. Instead, I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she had been recommended to me by a former colleague who had dealt with a workplace defamation situation 2 years earlier. Patricia was precise, unimpressed by drama, and the kind of person who asked questions the same way a surgeon makes incisions. Only where necessary, only as deep as required. I told her everything. The termination, the anonymous email, the HR summary, the hiring manager's warning, and what Nadia had overheard. Patricia listened without interrupting until I was done. Then she said, "Do you still have the HR summary they gave you at termination?" I did. "Do you have any of your original work product? Reports, client correspondence, data files, anything that would directly contradict the falsification claims?" I had backed up everything to a personal drive. A habit I had developed years ago for exactly the reason every professional eventually learns. Not because they expect betrayal, but because work belongs to the person who created it. Patricia said that was the most important thing I had told her. "The defamation claim has elements," she said carefully, "but we need Nadia on record. We need her to be willing to repeat what she heard in a formal setting." I called Nadia that same evening. She said yes without hesitating. "I should have called you the night it happened," she said. "I'm going to do whatever you need." I told her I needed her to tell the truth. That was all. "That," she said, "I can absolutely do." The weeks that followed were a strange kind of double life. During the day, I worked at Ridgeline. I delivered campaigns, answered emails, attended meetings, and gave every client the same standard of work I had always given. Nobody at Ridgeline knew about any of it. I hadn't told them, and I didn't intend to. My professional life was not a courtroom, and I had learned the hard way that the fewer people who know the details of your injuries, the less power those injuries have to define you. In the evenings, I sat at my kitchen table in my house, and worked with Patricia on building a case. We obtained records from Hargrove and Lane's HR department through a formal data subject access request. Those records showed the timeline of the complaint, the language used in the anonymous email, and the exact phrasing that had been relayed to Robert Ashby. Then we compared that language to Diane's documented communications. Diane had once sent me an email, years earlier during a family argument about something unrelated, where she had used a phrase nearly identical to one that appeared in the anonymous HR complaint. Not the same subject, not the same context, but the same construction, the same rhythm, the same subtle vocabulary that people who write in a particular way carry from document to document without realizing it. Patricia flagged it. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't proof by itself, but it was a tile in a floor. We also found that the phone number used to call Hargrove and Lane on the day of the initial complaint, the call Robert Ashby had mentioned receiving from a concerned party, had been made from a landline registered to an address I recognized. Diane's address. Not a burner phone, not a block number, a landline. She had been that confident, or that careless. Patricia said, "She didn't think you'd ever look." I thought about that for a long time. She had been right once. There was a version of me that would have blamed myself, accepted the loss, rebuilt quietly, and never asked why. That version of me had existed. I had lived inside her for years. But that version of me had bought a house with her own money and been burned for it. And something in the fire had changed the temperature at which I was willing to endure things. She was right about who I used to be, I said to Patricia. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. Then let's make sure she meets who you are now. Before we sent the demand letter, I did one thing I had not planned. I visited my mother. Not to tell her everything. Not yet. But because I needed to understand something about the shape of the years before I put a legal instrument in the middle of our family and watched the aftershocks move through everyone. My mother lived in the same house she had raised us in. It smelled like old carpet and the particular candles she had burned for 30 years and never changed. I sat at the kitchen table where Diane and I had done homework as children, and I looked at my mother's face, which had aged in the way faces do when the years have been more exhausting than unkind. I asked her, carefully, without accusation, whether Diane had ever said anything to her about my job. My mother looked at her coffee cup. "She mentioned she was worried about you," she said. "Did she say why?" "She said she had heard something, that there were problems at work." "Did she say how she heard?" My mother's hands moved on the table. "I didn't ask," she said quietly. "I thought it was just Diane worrying." There it was. Diane had told our mother, not as a confession, as a performance. She had worried aloud, generously with the appropriate amount of concern, and our mother had heard it and filed it under Diane caring about her sister. I didn't tell my mother the full truth that day. I wasn't ready to watch her decide which version of events was easier to live with. But I looked at her for a long moment and understood something I hadn't before. Diane had not acted alone in the sense that she had acted in an environment that had always forgiven her. Not because our mother was cruel, but because it is possible to love someone and never hold them accountable at the same time, and the two things can coexist for decades without anyone noticing the damage they're building. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a few minutes. Then I went inside my house, made tea, and called Patricia. "Send the letter," I said. The demand letter arrived at Diane's home on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because Nadia called me that evening to tell me Diane had phoned her in what Nadia described as barely controlled fury. Diane had said there was no proof of anything. She had said I was clearly unstable from the stress of my job loss and was looking for someone to blame. She had said our mother was going to be devastated. She had said a lot of things, but she had not said she hadn't done it. That absence spoke loudly. Patricia had instructed me not to communicate with Diane directly during this period. I followed that instruction, though it required a specific kind of discipline I was still learning. Every time I imagined the conversation I could have, every word I had earned the right to say, I had to set it down like something I wasn't yet allowed to pick up. 2 weeks after the letter, Diane's attorney responded. They disputed the phone record connection. They said the language similarity in the emails was coincidental. They said Nadia's account was hearsay and the result of a misunderstanding at a social gathering. Patricia read me their response without editorial. "They're nervous," she said. Nervous attorneys use a lot of words. She was not wrong. Over the following weeks, our side built its structure carefully. We obtained a formal written statement from Nadia. We obtained the original phone records through legal channels. We obtained my complete work file, every client report, every data point, every correspondence, and had 2 independent professionals in the marketing field review them for any evidence of falsification. Their conclusion was the same: clean, accurate, thoroughly documented. There had been no falsification. There had never been any falsification. There had only been one person's voice telling a story, and a system that had been too quick to believe it without checking the pages underneath. Robert Ashby received a formal communication from Patricia's office 4 months after I had been let go. I was not in the room for that conversation. Patricia relayed it to me afterward, carefully, the way people carry things they know matter. Robert had been shaken, not in a theatrical way, in the quiet way of someone who had done something he believed was necessary and was now confronting the possibility that he had been used. He asked whether there was anything he could do. Patricia told him there was. She asked him to provide a letter acknowledging that the evidence underlying my termination had not been independently verified and that the company had acted on an unsubstantiated third-party complaint. He agreed without hesitation. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time when it arrived. Not because it fixed everything. Not because it gave me back the 6 years or the salary or the title or the specific shape of the life I had built. But because it said, in plain language, that the story Diane had told was not true. And now there was a document that existed in the world that said so. Some things cannot be quantified, but some things can be recorded, and records have a way of outlasting the silence around them. The resolution came 4 months after the demand letter, through a mediated agreement. Diane did not admit wrongdoing in the formal sense. Agreements like this rarely require that, and Patricia had prepared me for the likelihood. What Diane agreed to, through her attorney, was a financial settlement, partial compensation for lost wages and documented professional damage, and a legally binding commitment to make no further contact with any current or future employer of mine, directly or indirectly, under any circumstances. That last clause was the one I cared about most. The money helped. I won't pretend otherwise. 8 months at a reduced salary with a mortgage had thinned my cushion in ways I was still working to rebuild. But the clause felt like something more permanent than money. It felt like a lock on a door I had not known was open. The evening the agreement was signed, I sat on the floor of my living room with a glass of wine and no television, and just let the house be quiet around me. I thought about Diane's voice when she had called her employer. I thought about Robert's face in the meeting where he handed me the HR summary. I thought about the hiring manager who had told me to get ahead of it. I thought about 8 months of plain pasta and contract work and showing up anyway. And I thought about my mortgage, which I had paid every single month on time, without missing once. That too felt like a record. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't appear in legal documents but lives in the architecture of who you are. Telling my mother was the hardest part of all of it. I chose a Sunday. I brought pastries from the bakery near my house, the one she had always liked, and I sat across from her at that same kitchen table and told her the truth from the beginning. My mother is not a woman who shows pain immediately. She absorbs it first, processes it somewhere interior and unseen, and you only know it has arrived when she goes very still. She went very still. I watched her face move through something that had no simple name. When I finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "She told me she was worried about you." "I know," I said. "She cried at the table, about how you were struggling." "I know." "And all of it?" She stopped. "All of it was her," I said quietly. My mother pressed her hand flat on the table, a gesture I had seen her make my entire life when she was trying to keep herself steady. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "You don't have to do anything with it today," I told her. She looked at me with something in her eyes I hadn't seen from her in years. It was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of someone who has loved their children equally and discovered, too late, that equal love is not the same as equal accountability. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I should have asked more questions." I reached across the table and held her hand. "You didn't know," I said. And that was true. She hadn't known. But something had changed between us after that conversation, and not in the direction of distance. If anything, it moved closer. We had stopped navigating around the shape of things and were finally speaking about the thing itself. That, too, was something I had not expected to gain from all of this. I don't know what Diane did with the months after the agreement. I don't know because I removed her from my life with the same quiet efficiency I had used to build it. No announcement, no speech, no long letter explaining my reasoning. I simply stopped. I stopped responding. I stopped appearing at events I knew she would attend. I let our shared history fold itself up and settle somewhere that was no longer my living room. Some people found this cold. One of our aunts called to say she hoped we could all find a way to move forward together. I thanked her for calling and explained that I had already moved forward. I just hadn't moved in the direction she was picturing. Forgiveness is not the same as proximity. I have learned this the slow way, the way you learn most things that matter. Not from reading it somewhere, but from living through the alternative long enough to understand the difference in your body. I don't wish Diane harm. I don't replay the anger. I don't keep a list. But I also don't call. The boundary is not punishment. The boundary is the shape of the life I decided I was allowed to have. A year after the settlement, I was offered a position at a firm called Callaway Brand Strategy. The director who hired me, a woman named Serena Park, had known my work for years through mutual industry contacts. She told me during our final interview that she had heard some noise about my departure from Hargrove and Lane, but that she had also heard what came after it, and that in her experience, the people who fight for their own record tend to be the same people who protect the records of those around them. I started the following Monday. Within 6 months, I was leading my own accounts. Within a year, I had a team of 3. The work was not easier than it had been before. It was harder, bigger, more visible, but I was doing it inside a house I owned and a reputation I had rebuilt by hand, and that combination made everything feel different in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not had both of those things taken and then earned back. Some mornings, I drive to work past the coffee shop where I used to sit during those 8 months of uncertainty, staring at my laptop and quietly refusing to believe that this was how things ended. I don't stop there anymore. but I notice it every time. I think it is useful to notice. It reminds me that there was a version of events where Diane won, not because she was right, but because I might have been too tired and too ashamed to keep looking. That version of events did not happen because I kept looking. I still live in my house. People have told me over the years to buy something bigger now that my career has recovered. Something with more rooms, a better neighborhood, a longer driveway. But I don't want a longer driveway. I want this driveway. The one I drove into on the day I signed the papers and sat in my car and cried for the first time as someone who owned the ground beneath their feet. I have repainted 2 rooms. I replaced the kitchen faucet myself, badly and then correctly, after watching 4 tutorial videos in a row. I planted something in the backyard every spring, and every spring something grows that I did not expect. Last autumn, I found a small chip in the windowsill near the front door. I don't know how it got there. I thought about filling it in, but then I left it. It is not damage. It is record. Everything that has happened to this house and to me is in the material of it somewhere. And I have decided to let the house keep its history the same way I have kept mine. Not because I want to live in it, but because I don't need to pretend it wasn't real. A few months ago, a woman I know slightly from a professional network reached out to me privately. She had just been let go from her job. She was 3 weeks out from her own lease signing. She had received a vague explanation from HR about complaints she couldn't trace and a job market that kept going quiet when she walked into it. She asked if I had any advice. I told her to back up everything she had created, in her own name, in a place that belonged to her. I told her to find someone who could help her understand the legal shape of what had happened. I told her not to spend too much time trying to understand why someone would do something like this, because the why rarely helps you and the who is what matters. And I told her, do not stop paying your mortgage. She laughed, a little startled. It sounds strange, she said. It is strange, I said. But when everything else is uncertain, the thing that is in your name and under your feet is the thing you fight for. Everything else can be rebuilt, but that is the ground. You keep the ground. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, was it someone in your family? I said yes. She said, did they think they were going to win? I thought about Diane on that phone call, about the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable, about the certainty of a person who had done something like this before in smaller ways and had always watched it work. Yes, I said. She thought she was going to win. What changed? I thought about that for a moment. She forgot that I document everything. So, if your sister called your employer and ended your career the week you bought your first home, and then smiled at family dinners for 8 months while you quietly rebuilt, what would you do? Would you confront her immediately? Would you wait and build your case? Or would you walk away and never give her access to your life again? Comment below. I want to know what you would have done. And if something like this has happened to you, know that the ground is still yours. What was taken by a voice can be reclaimed by a record. You just have to keep looking until you find the proof. Our team is committed to creating fictional, real-life stories that give viewers drama, emotion, and thoughtful lessons. This video was made for entertainment and educational purposes only. We hope viewers take away the message that real strength is not erasing what was done to you. It is refusing to let it be the last word about who you are. Expanded scenes, inserted throughout for 55-minute runtime. Insert after, I was wrong once, there was a version of me. Paragraph. Expanded, the history of Diane. Let me tell you about the version of Diane I grew up with, because she is important to understand before this story makes sense. Diane was not a monster in the way people imagine monsters. She was charming at dinner parties. She remembered names. She sent cards for birthdays. If you met her once, you would probably like her immediately. The problem with Diane was not that she was cruel in public. The problem was that she was surgical in private. When I was 10 and she was 13, I won a writing competition at school. A small thing. A local essay contest, a $20 gift card, a framed certificate they handed out at an assembly. My teacher, Mrs. Callahan, had pulled me aside beforehand and told me she was proud of me and the way teachers speak when they mean it. I told Diane that night at dinner, glowing in the way children glow when an adult has seen them clearly. Diane smiled and said, "Mrs. Callahan says that to everyone." Not cruelly, not loudly, just levelly, the way you correct a factual error, and then she went back to her food. My glow did not survive the sentence. I told myself for years that she hadn't meant it, that she was just being realistic, that I was too sensitive. I want to speak directly to anyone who has had that experience. The experience of a person in your family who specializes in the quietly deflating remark. The perfectly timed observation that doesn't sound like an attack because it arrives wearing the costume of truth. It is not truth. It is control. And the reason it works so well on people who love you is precisely because you extend the benefit of the doubt that you would never extend to a stranger. When I was 16, I got a part in the school play. A secondary role, not the lead, but visible, and named, and mine. Diane told my mother she hoped I wasn't going to embarrass myself. When I got my first boyfriend, she told me he had been interested in her first. I don't know whether that last thing was true. I never asked. But I noticed that it made me hold the relationship more loosely than I might have otherwise, and that the looseness contributed to it ending sooner than it might have. That was the pattern. She didn't break things directly. She loosened the bolts, just enough, and then waited for motion to do the rest. By the time I graduated college and moved to the city for my first real job, I had accumulated a full internal library of these moments. A library I had been too loyal to read clearly. I told myself we were different people with different temperaments. I told myself all siblings have friction. I told myself that the love underneath it was real, even if the expressions of it were complicated. The house was the moment I stopped telling myself that. Not because buying a house is the most important thing a person can do, but because it was the most purely mine thing I had ever done. No competition. No comparison. Just me and the years of work behind me and a set of keys. And she had looked at that and decided to take it apart. That decision told me everything the library had been trying to say. Insert after the Nadia call section. Expanded. The wait of 8 months. I want to be honest about those 8 months, because I think honesty is more useful than the version where the person who has been wronged moves through adversity with graceful composure and emerges polished on the other side. There were days I woke up at 3 a.m. with the specific dread that lives in the chest like a stone that hasn't moved. The kind of dread that doesn't have a single object. It's not about one thing. It's about everything at once. The mortgage and the reputation and the silence from the industry and the quiet question underneath all of it. Did I do something that made this possible? That question was the most damaging one. Not the financial pressure. Not the professional setback. The question of whether I had somehow contributed to my own undoing. Whether there was something in the way I had lived my life or conducted my work or managed my relationships that had made me a reasonable target. I sat with that question for weeks before I was able to see it clearly. And what I eventually saw was this. That question was not mine. It had been placed in me by someone who had spent years making me responsible for their discomfort. Diane had been practicing that transfer my entire life, shifting the weight of her own inadequacy onto the closest available surface. And I had carried it so many times that I had learned to pick it up automatically. Setting it down was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single moment of clarity. It happened slowly in the evenings at the kitchen table of my house, where no one else's voice lived but my own. I also want to say something about Ridgeline Creative and the people there, because they are part of this story even though they don't know it. The work was smaller. The scope was narrower. But there was a junior designer there named Elliot who asked me once, entirely without agenda, what the most important thing I had learned in my career was. I thought about it for longer than he probably expected, and I said, document everything you create in your own name from the beginning. Not because you expect to be betrayed, but because your work is yours and the proof of that should live somewhere that belongs to you. Elliot nodded and went back to his screen, and I don't think he understood fully what I meant. But saying it out loud made something settle in me. I had the proof. I had always had the proof. Diane had made one fundamental miscalculation. She had assumed I was the kind of person who didn't back things up. She had assumed I would absorb the loss and rebuild quietly and never look behind me. She had read the old version of me, the one who accepted the deflation and moved on, and bet her entire gamble on that version still being who I was. She had been wrong by about 3 years. Insert before the settlement section. Expanded. The conversation I didn't have. There is a version of this story where I called Diane the night I found out and said everything I had earned the right to say. I have lived that version in my head. Many times. I know every word of it. I know the way her voice would have sounded. First defensive, then brittle. Then pivoting to how she had always been the one who was hurt. How our parents had always favored me in ways I never acknowledged. How she had done what anyone would have done to someone who made them feel invisible. I know that conversation. I have had it in the silent hours of too many nights. But I also know what it would have cost. She would have told our mother before I had the chance to. She would have framed it as me attacking her, lashing out after my professional failure, looking for a scapegoat. She would have cried, the specific, practiced kind of crying she had always been able to produce. And my mother would have been in the middle of 2 daughters instead of in possession of the truth. And perhaps more honestly, I was not ready to say those words in a way that served anything other than the release of saying them. Patricia had told me early on that the most powerful position in a situation like this is the one where you speak last, loudest, and on record. Not on the phone. Not in a doorway. On record. I thought about that every time I picked up my phone and put it back down. The restraint cost something. I am not going to pretend it was easy or noble. Some nights it felt like I was swallowing glass and calling it patience. But the record was building. And records have longer lives than arguments. Insert after I still live in my house section. Expanded. What rebuilding actually looks like. I want to say something about the word rebuilding, because it is used too easily in stories like this, and it deserves more precision. Rebuilding is not returning to what you had. What I had before, the title, the salary, the particular professional life at Hargrove and Lane, I did not get back. I was not restored to a previous state. That is not how any of this works, and I think it is important to say so clearly, because the narrative of complete restoration is a comfortable lie that makes good endings in films and quietly misleads people who are living inside the harder version. What I built instead was different. Not better in the simple sense of being larger or more impressive. Different in the sense of being built on foundations I had personally inspected and found sound. At Callaway, I knew every account I managed because I had built the relationship from the first email. I knew every member of my team because I had hired them myself and understood what they needed to do good work. I knew the structure of my own value because I had spent 8 months operating without the scaffolding of a recognized company name and discovered that the work stood on its own. That knowledge, the kind you earn by having everything stripped away and building again from the bottom, is not something you can manufacture through success. It only comes through the specific education of losing what you worked for and choosing to work again anyway. I am a better strategist now than I was before Diane made that phone call. I say this not with gratitude to her. I am not grateful to Diane. I do not subscribe to the idea that people who hurt you are secretly teachers and you should thank them for the lesson. That is a philosophy that asks the person who is harmed to perform wisdom for the comfort of everyone watching, and I am not interested in performing anything. What I believe is simpler, that difficult things make you more skilled at living through difficult things, and that skill, once built, belongs to you regardless of how it was built. I would have preferred to acquire it some other way, but I have it now, and it is mine. Final closing edition, before the comments call to action. The chip in the windowsill is still there. I looked at it this morning, the way I do sometimes when I'm leaving for work, and I thought about everything that happened between the day I first noticed it and today. The meetings, the letters, the mediations, the mornings at 3 with the stone in my chest, the plain pasta, the contract work, the drive past the coffee shop, Serena Park saying the word fought and meaning it as a compliment. The phone call I did not make. The record I built instead. I picked up my bag and locked the door behind me, and the house sat quiet in the morning light. Intact. The same as it was the day I first turned the key in the lock and stood inside it and understood for the first time what it meant to own the ground beneath your feet. Some things can be taken, but the ground, if you keep paying for it and refuse to leave, remains. I walk out of that door every day knowing that.